The morning broke over the quiet suburban cul-de-sac with the kind of serene perfection that felt almost scripted, like a scene from a feel-good family movie. The sun hung low, casting golden rays across neatly trimmed lawns, each blade of grass practically saluting the dawn. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of blooming azaleas and the mouth-watering aroma of bacon sizzling on someone's grill a few houses down. It was the kind of Saturday that made you want to linger on the porch with a cup of coffee, maybe flip through a newspaper or scroll lazily through your phone, savoring the rare absence of chaos. This was my neighborhood, a postcard of American suburban life in Virginia, where the biggest drama was usually Mrs. Harrow's ongoing feud with her neighbor's slightly overgrown hedges. But today, that illusion of peace would shatter faster than a cheap wine glass at a toddler's birthday party. I was up early, as usual, puttering around the kitchen in my faded UVA sweatshirt, the one I'd had since my college days. The coffee maker gurgled happily, filling the room with its rich, earthy aroma. My wife, Ellen, was still upstairs, probably debating whether to tackle her yoga routine or sneak in another chapter of her latest mystery novel. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional chirp of a sparrow outside. It was the kind of morning that made you feel like the world was giving you a break, a little pocket of calm before the inevitable demands of life crept back in. I was looking forward to a low-key day, maybe a walk to the park with Ellen, maybe a nap in the hammock out back. But the universe, as it often does, had other plans. My daughter, Clare, was due to arrive any minute. She'd called the night before, her voice bright and teasing over the phone, promising to swing by with donuts and stories from her latest assignment. Clare was a force of nature, always had been. At 32, she was a tactical commander with the FBI, a role that sounded like it belonged in a Hollywood blockbuster, but was, in her case, just another Tuesday. She'd climbed the ranks faster than most, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she was relentless, sharp, and had a knack for staying calm when everyone else was losing their minds. I'd seen her handle everything from teenage rebellions to high-stakes training exercises with the same unflappable precision, and I couldn't have been prouder. But today, she wasn't Agent Clare Matthews, tactical commander. She was just my kid, coming home to visit her old man, maybe to laugh about the time I tried to fix the garage door and ended up stuck in it for an hour. I heard the low rumble of her Jeep before I saw it, the familiar growl of its engine cutting through the morning stillness. Claire pulled into the driveway, parking with her usual casual confidence, the front tire just kissing the edge of what I vaguely recalled was a visitor parking only section. The lines on the pavement were so faded they were practically a suggestion, worn away by years of sun and neglect. Nobody cared about those lines. Nobody, that is, except Doug. Doug was the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian, a man who wore his HOA security badge like it was a Purple Heart. He was the kind of guy who'd argue over a coupon at Costco and call it a moral victory when he got his 50 cents back. In his late 40s, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his ill-fitting khaki uniform, Doug had no real authority, no real training, and certainly no business carrying the chipped ego he dragged around like a ball and chain. His security gig was a volunteer role, one he'd taken on with the zeal of a man desperate to feel important. He patrolled the neighborhood in a battered golf cart, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes about minor infractions, trash cans left out past pickup day, mailboxes with slightly peeling paint, cars parked a hair too close to a hydrant. To Doug, these were crimes against the sacred HOA code, and he was the lone sheriff in a lawless land. I'd had my own run-ins with Doug over the years. Once, he'd left a strongly worded note on my windshield because my truck was obstructing the aesthetic flow of the cul-de-sac. I'd laughed it off, tossed the note in the recycling, and gone about my day. Most of the neighbors did the same. Doug was a nuisance, but a predictable one, like a mosquito you could swat away with a little patience. Nobody took him seriously. Nobody, that is, until today. Claire hopped out of her Jeep, a paper bag from the local bakery tucked under one arm, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She was dressed down, no trace of the tactical gear or stern expression she wore on the job. Just jeans, sneakers, and a faded FBI Academy hoodie that hung comfortably on her athletic frame. She flashed me a grin as she climbed the porch steps, the kind of smile that could disarm a room full of skeptics. "Morning, Dad," she said, holding up the bag. "Got your favorite, glazed with a side of chocolate sprinkles." "You're spoiling me," I said, taking the bag and ushering her inside. The donuts smelled like heaven, and I was already plotting how many I could sneak before Ellen noticed. We settled at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window, painting the room in warm hues. Claire poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and started catching me up on her life. Her last assignment had taken her to some undisclosed location. She was cagey about the details, as always, but she'd come out of it unscathed, with a few new scars and a story about a rookie agent who'd accidentally set off a smoke grenade during a drill. We laughed, the kind of easy, familiar laughter that made the years melt away, like she was still the kid who'd begged me to let her stay up past bedtime to watch one more episode of X-Files. Outside, the neighborhood hummed along in its usual rhythm. Kids rode bikes in lazy circles, their laughter echoing down the street. A lawnmower roared to life a few houses over, its drone blending with the chatter of sparrows. It was the kind of morning that made you forget the world could be anything but kind. Claire was halfway through a story about her team's latest training exercise when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whine, like a mosquito buzzing too close to your ear. I glanced out the window and saw Doug's golf cart tearing across the street, its bald tires squealing as it lurched to a stop in front of Claire's Jeep. "Oh, great," I muttered, recognizing the cart's faded HOA logo. "Here comes the parking police." Claire followed my gaze, her expression shifting from amused to mildly curious. "Who's that?" "Doug," I said, rolling my eyes. "Our resident HOA hero. Probably about to write you a ticket for parking on the wrong side of the moon." She chuckled, taking a sip of her coffee. "Let him try." I should have known better than to underestimate Claire, but I also should have known better than to underestimate Doug's ability to turn a molehill into a mountain. From the kitchen window, I watched him climb out of the cart, his clipboard clutched like a holy relic. His face was already flushed, a shade of pink that suggested he'd worked himself into a lather before he even got here. He circled Claire's Jeep like a vulture, scribbling furiously, muttering to himself. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could imagine it, some nonsense about community standards, visitor parking violations, the sanctity of the HOA bylaws. It was the kind of performance that would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Claire, unfazed, set her coffee down and stood up. "I'll handle this," she said, her tone light but with an edge I recognized. It was the same tone she'd used as a teenager when she'd caught her younger brother sneaking cookies from the jar, calm, but with a promise of consequences. "Be nice," I called after her, half joking. "He's not worth the paperwork." She shot me a grin over her shoulder and stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind her. I stayed by the window, expecting a quick exchange, maybe a sarcastic comment from Claire that would send Doug scurrying back to his cart. But as I watched, the scene unfolded in a way that made my stomach twist. Doug was in full lecture mode now, waving his clipboard like a conductor's baton, his voice carrying across the lawn. "This is a visitor parking violation," he barked, his words sharp and shrill. "You can't just park wherever you want. There are rules." Claire, leaning casually against the side of her Jeep, crossed her arms and tilted her head, studying him like he was a mildly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Can you point me to the sign that says visitors can't park here?" she asked, her voice even, almost polite. Doug faltered, his clipboard dropping an inch as he fumbled for a response. It's in the community guidelines," he sputtered, his face turning a deeper shade of pink. "Everyone knows you can't park here without a permit." "Everyone?" Claire raised an eyebrow, her tone still calm but with a hint of challenge. Because I don't see any signs, and those lines are barely visible. So, maybe you could clarify which guideline I'm violating. It was a simple question, the kind of thing you'd ask a bureaucrat to watch them squirm. But to Doug, it was a declaration of war. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his head, the kind of gears that only spun in the mind of a man who'd spent years convincing himself he was the most important person in a 5-mile radius. He took a step closer, puffing out his chest, which only made his beer gut more prominent. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he snapped. "You're a guest here, and you'll follow the rules, or I'll have your vehicle towed." Claire didn't move, didn't flinch. She just stood there, her posture relaxed, her expression almost amused. "Towed," she repeated, as if testing the word for flavor. "On what authority?" That was the moment I knew things were about to go sideways. Doug wasn't used to being questioned, not by neighbors, not by anyone. To him, his HOA badge was a crown, his clipboard a scepter. And here was this woman, young, confident, utterly unimpressed, daring to challenge his dominion. I could see the anger building in him, the kind of anger that came from years of being ignored, dismissed, laughed at behind his back. His face went from pink to crimson, his hands trembling as he gripped his clipboard like it was the only thing keeping him from exploding. "I'm the security officer," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I have the authority. You're a suspicious person, and I'm detaining you until I get some ID." The word, detaining, hit me like a punch to the gut. I was still by the window, my coffee forgotten, my heart starting to pound. This wasn't just Doug being a nuisance anymore. This was something else, something dangerous. Claire, though, didn't seem fazed. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, like she was sizing him up. "You're detaining me?" she asked, her voice low, almost curious. "With what legal authority?" That's when it happened. Doug, in a move so reckless it would have made a reality TV producer weep with joy, reached for his belt and yanked out a pistol. A real, honest-to-God firearm, its barrel gleaming dully in the morning light. He pointed it straight at Claire's chest, his hands shaking, but his face twisted with a mix of fear and triumph. "You're under citizen's arrest," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Get on the ground, now." Time seemed to slow down. My breath caught in my throat, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Claire, my daughter, stood there with a gun pointed at her, not 10 feet from where I'd taught her to ride a bike, where we'd carved pumpkins on Halloween, where we'd waved to neighbors on our way to Sunday barbecues. This wasn't a war zone. This wasn't one of her missions. This was our front yard, and some idiot with a power complex was threatening her life over a parking spot. I yanked the front door open so hard it slammed into the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot of its own. I stumbled onto the porch, my heart hammering so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. "Doug, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. But before I could take another step, Claire's eyes flicked toward me, and she gave the tiniest shake of her head. "Stay back," it said. "I've got this." And she did. Claire didn't flinch, didn't cower. If anything, her stance got even more relaxed, like she was dealing with an overexcited puppy instead of a man with a loaded gun. She looked at Doug, her expression calm, almost pitying. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, her voice steady, the kind of voice that could make a room full of hardened criminals rethink their life choices. Because once you escalate, there's no going back. Doug, too far gone in his own delusion, didn't hear the warning. He screamed again, something about the HOA, about community standards, about how she was a threat to everything he stood for. His finger hovered near the trigger, twitching nervously, and my stomach lurched. I wanted to run to her, to tackle Doug, to do something, anything, to protect my daughter. But I knew Claire. She wasn't just my kid. She was a trained agent, a woman who'd faced down threats I couldn't even imagine. Doug wasn't a threat to her. He was an inconvenience, a mosquito buzzing too close to her coffee. The neighbors were starting to notice now, peeking from behind curtains, stepping onto their porches, phones raised to record what they probably thought was some kind of HOA skit. A few laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when Doug racked the slide on his gun, the laughter stopped. The air grew heavy, the kind of heavy that comes when everyone realizes something is about to go very, very wrong. Claire, though, was a statue of calm. She spoke again, her voice slow, deliberate, like she was talking to a child throwing a tantrum. "Let's talk about this, Doug," she said, using his name for the first time, a subtle move that made him blink in surprise. "You're upset about a parking spot. I get it. But pulling a gun? That's a felony. You know that, right?" Doug's face twisted, a mix of rage and confusion. "You're the criminal," he shouted. "You're trespassing. You're violating the rules. I'm protecting this neighborhood." Claire's eyes flicked toward the growing crowd, calculating, assessing. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost casual, she reached into her pocket. Doug's finger twitched on the trigger, and my heart stopped. "Don't move," he screamed, his voice high and panicked. But Claire didn't stop. She pulled out a slim black wallet, her movements deliberate, controlled. With 2 fingers, she flicked it open, holding it up for everyone to see. The gold badge inside caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation were unmistakable, even from across the lawn. The air seemed to suck out of the cul-de-sac, leaving a silence so profound I could hear a neighbor's phone slip from their hand and hit the pavement. Doug's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted from the badge to Claire's face, then back again, as if hoping it was a trick, a prop, anything but the real thing. Claire's voice, when she spoke, was cold, precise, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Agent Claire Matthews, FBI," she said. "You've just committed aggravated assault on a federal officer. Drop the weapon now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Doug's hands shook, the gun sagging in his grip. The neighbors, who'd been filming with a mix of amusement and curiosity, now stood frozen, their phones still raised, but their faces pale. Claire stood there, badge in hand, as calm as if she were ordering a sandwich at a deli. And Doug, the man who'd thought he was king of the cul-de-sac, was about to learn just how far out of his league he really was. The cul-de-sac had gone deathly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like a physical weight. The morning sun, still climbing lazily in the sky, cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and the faint smell of bacon from someone's grill lingered in the air, now tinged with the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Doug stood there, his pistol trembling in his hands, the barrel pointed at my daughter Claire's chest. His face was a blotchy crimson, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool Virginia breeze. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd stepped into a lion's den, but his pride, or maybe his stupidity, kept him from backing down. Across from him, Claire was a statue of calm, her faded FBI Academy hoodie and jeans giving her the casual air of someone out for a weekend errand, not a federal agent staring down a loaded gun. Her eyes, though, told a different story, sharp, calculating, like a chess grandmaster sizing up a reckless opponent's next move. I was still on the porch, my heart jackhammering in my chest, one hand gripping the railing so hard I thought I'd snap it. Every instinct screamed at me to run to her, to shove Doug to the ground, to do something, anything, to protect my daughter. But Claire's tiny shake of her head, "Stay back," kept me rooted in place. She had this. She always had this. Doug, on the other hand, was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. His voice, high and shrill, cracked as he shouted, "You're under citizen's arrest. Get on the ground, now." The words sounded absurd, like a kid playing cops and robbers, but the gun in his hands was no toy. It was real, and it was loaded, and it was pointed at my kid. The neighbors, who'd started gathering like moths to a flame, were no longer laughing. Phones were still raised, recording every second, But the giggles and whispers had died out when Doug racked the slide on his pistol, the metallic clack echoing like a warning shot. A few people stepped back, their faces paling as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't an HOA skit gone wrong. This was a man with a gun, threatening a woman over a parking spot, and the air was thick with the potential for something catastrophic. Mrs. Harrow, the neighborhood's resident busybody, clutched her terrier to her chest, her eyes wide behind her oversized glasses. Mr. Peterson, who usually spent his mornings tinkering with his vintage Mustang, stood frozen on his driveway, a wrench dangling from his hand. Even the kids on their bikes had stopped circling, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Claire, though, didn't flinch. If anything, her posture relaxed further, her shoulders loosening as if she were settling into a comfortable chair instead of facing a loaded firearm. She tilted her head slightly, studying Doug with a mix of curiosity and pity, like he was a lab rat who'd just pressed the wrong lever. "Citizen's arrest?" she repeated, her voice low, almost conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. "You're detaining me, Doug? On what grounds?" The use of his name hit him like a jab. He blinked, his grip on the gun faltering for a split second, as if he hadn't expected her to know who he was. You're violating HOA rules," he stammered, his voice climbing another octave. "You're a suspicious person. You refuse to show ID. I'm protecting this neighborhood." Claire's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile, but it wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smile a predator gives its prey right before the chase ends. "Protecting the neighborhood," she echoed, her tone flat. "By pulling a gun on someone over a parking spot? That's your play here." Doug's face twisted, a mix of rage and desperation. He took a step closer, the gun shaking in his hands, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "You don't get to question me," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I'm the security officer. I have authority. You're a threat, and I'm handling it." I felt my stomach lurch. Handling it? This wasn't handling anything. This was a man with no training, no credentials, and no business holding a firearm, let alone pointing it at anyone. Doug wasn't a cop. He wasn't even a rent-a-cop. He was a volunteer HOA busybody who'd somehow convinced himself he was the neighborhood's last line of defense. And now he was inches away from making the worst mistake of his life. Claire's eyes flicked toward the growing crowd, taking in the phones, the wide-eyed stares, the nervous whispers. She was reading the room, calculating every variable, the distance between her and Doug, the angle of the gun, the mood of the onlookers. I'd seen her do this before, not in person but in stories she'd told me late at night over beers on the back porch. She talked about hostage situations, bomb threats, active shooter drills, always with the same detached precision, like she was describing a math problem. That's what made her so good at her job. While everyone else was panicking, Claire was solving the equation. "You're escalating this, Doug," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, like she was talking him off a ledge. "You've got a gun on me, no legal authority, and a crowd of witnesses filming every word you say. You sure this is the hill you want to die on?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Doug's eyes darted to the neighbors, then back to Claire, his bravado cracking under the weight of her words. For a moment, I thought he might back down, lower the gun, realize he was in way over his head. But Doug wasn't the backing down type. He was the double down type, the kind of guy who'd argue with a brick wall and expect it to apologize. His face hardened, and he jabbed the gun forward, his voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "I'm not dying on any hill," he shouted. "You're the one who's done. Get on the ground or I'll. You'll what?" Claire cut in, her voice suddenly sharp, like a whip cracking. "Shoot me? In front of all these people? Over a parking violation you can't even prove." The challenge was a calculated risk, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Claire was pushing him, testing his resolve, forcing him to confront the absurdity of his actions. It was a tactic she'd honed over years of dealing with volatile situations, but it was still a gamble. Doug's finger was still on the trigger, and his hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure he could aim straight even if he wanted to. The crowd was holding its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might snap. Doug's mouth opened, then closed, his brain scrambling for a response. You're a threat, he finally managed, his voice weaker now, less certain. I'm defending the HOA. I'm defending our standards. Claire's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dangerous in her expression. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of cold, focused intensity that made my skin prickle. Defending the HOA, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. With a gun you probably don't even have a permit for. You're not a cop, Doug. You're not even a security guard. You're a guy with a clipboard and a power trip, and you're about to ruin your life. The words hit him like a slap, and I saw his shoulders slump, just for a second, before he doubled down again. You don't know who I am, he screamed, his voice cracking. I'm authorized. I'm in charge here. You're under arrest, and you're going to jail. That's when it happened. Claire's hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward her pocket. Doug's eyes widened, his finger twitching on the trigger, and I felt my entire body tense, every muscle screaming to intervene. Don't move, he bellowed, his voice raw with panic. I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot. But Claire didn't stop. Her movements were smooth, almost leisurely, like she was reaching for her keys or a stick of gum. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the cul-de-sac. I wanted to shout, to tell her to stop, to do something to break the spell, but I was frozen, pinned in place by the sheer force of her confidence. She knew what she was doing. She always knew. Her hand emerged from her pocket, holding a slim black wallet, the kind you'd mistake for a credit card holder if you didn't know better. Doug's face contorted, his voice rising to a near screech. What's that? A weapon? Drop it. Drop it now. Claire didn't drop it. Instead, with a flick of her wrist, she opened the wallet, holding it up so the sunlight caught the gold badge inside. It gleamed like a star, unmistakable even from where I stood on the porch. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation were etched in bold, authoritative letters, and they hit the scene like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint clatter of a neighbor's phone slipping from their hand and hitting the concrete. Doug's mouth fell open, his eyes bulging as he stared at the badge, then at Claire, then back at the badge, as if hoping it would vanish if he blinked hard enough. His hands shook violently, the gun sagging in his grip, the barrel dipping toward the ground. The crowd was frozen, their phones still raised, capturing every second of Doug's unraveling. Mrs. Harrow's terrier yipped once, then fell silent, as if even the dog knew this was a moment to shut up. Claire's voice, when she spoke, was cold, precise, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Agent Claire Matthews, FBI, she said, her words slicing through the stunned air. You've just committed aggravated assault on a federal officer, Doug. That's a felony. Drop the weapon now, or this gets a lot worse for you. The words landed like a sledgehammer. Doug's knees wobbled, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost in a bad uniform. The gun trembled in his hands, and for a moment, I thought he might actually drop it, not out of compliance, but because his body was shutting down under the weight of his own stupidity. But Doug, true to form, wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He shook his head, his voice a hoarse whisper. No, you're lying. You're not FBI. You're just some girl. Claire's eyebrow arched, and that faint, predatory smile returned. Some girl, she repeated, her tone laced with mockery. Doug, I'm the girl who's about to have you in cuffs if you don't put that gun down. Last chance. The crowd was buzzing now, whispers rippling through the neighbors like wildfire. FBI, someone muttered. Did she say FBI? Another voice hissed. Mr. Peterson dropped his wrench, the clang echoing in the stillness. Mrs. Harrow clutched her dog tighter, her mouth moving soundlessly, as if she were praying or cursing or both. The kids on their bikes were wide-eyed, their parents pulling them back, suddenly aware that this wasn't a game. Doug's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a lifeline, anything to salvage his crumbling empire. But there was nothing. No one was coming to his rescue. The neighbors, who'd once tolerated his petty tyranny, were now filming him with a mix of horror and fascination, their phones capturing his downfall in high definition. He was alone, exposed, and he knew it. Claire took a slow, deliberate step forward, her badge still raised, her voice dropping to a chilling calm. "You've got 3 seconds, Doug," she said. 1. Doug's hands shook harder, the gun wobbling in his grip. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a strangled sound, like a man drowning in his own panic. 2. Claire said, her voice steady, unyielding. She took another step, closing the distance between them, her presence filling the space like a storm cloud. Doug's eyes widened, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The gun dipped further, his fingers twitching, and I could see the war raging in his head, pride versus survival, ego versus reality. He was a man who'd spent years building a fantasy where he was the hero, the protector, the law. And now, in the span of a few minutes, Claire had dismantled it all without raising her voice. 3, Claire said, her voice like steel. She stopped, her badge gleaming, her eyes locked on Doug's, daring him to make a move. That was it. Doug's resolve crumbled like a sandcastle under a wave. His hands dropped, the gun clattering to the pavement with a dull thud. He staggered back, his knees buckling, and sank to the ground, his hands raised in surrender. "I didn't know," he whimpered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know you were FBI. I was just doing my job." Claire didn't move. She stood over him, her badge still in hand, her expression unreadable. "Your job," she said, her voice low, cutting. "Your job is to harass people over parking spots? To pull a gun on a federal agent? You're not a cop, Doug. You're not even a security guard. You're a liability, and you're under investigation now." The words hit him like a freight train. Doug's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as he babbled incoherently, something about the HOA, about community standards, about how he didn't mean it. But nobody was listening. The neighbors were too busy filming, whispering, processing the fact that their self-appointed sheriff had just been taken down by a woman who looked like she'd just rolled out of bed for coffee. Claire reached into her hoodie, her movements smooth and practiced, and tapped a hidden mic clipped to the inside of her collar. "Dispatch, this is Agent Claire Matthews, badge 87392, she said, her voice crisp, professional. "I have an armed individual threatening a federal officer. Immediate backup requested. Location transmitting now." The call was like a gavel slamming down, sealing Doug's fate. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder, their shrill cry cutting through the stunned silence of the cul-de-sac. Doug's head snapped up, his eyes wild with panic, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Claire's presence pinned him to the ground as surely as if she'd cuffed him herself. I finally stepped off the porch, my legs shaky, my heart still pounding. I walked toward Claire, not sure what to say, not sure there was anything to say. She glanced at me, her expression softening for a split second, and gave me a small nod, as if to say, "It's okay, Dad. I've got this." And she did. She always did. Doug was still blubbering, his hands raised, his voice a pathetic whine. "I didn't know," he kept saying over and over like a broken record. "I was just protecting the neighborhood. I didn't know." Claire didn't respond. She stood over him, her badge catching the sunlight, her posture relaxed but commanding, like a general surveying a battlefield. The gun lay on the pavement, a sad, impotent symbol of Doug's failed power grab. The neighbors were buzzing now, their whispers growing louder, their phones capturing every angle of Doug's humiliation. Some were shaking their heads, others were laughing, but most were just staring, trying to process the fact that the man who'd terrorized them over mailbox colors and lawn ornaments had just picked a fight with the wrong woman. The sirens were closer now, their wail filling the air, promising consequences Doug couldn't talk his way out of. Claire didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't need to. She'd already won, not by force, but by being smarter, calmer, better. Doug thought he was the law. Claire was the law. And in that moment, as the squad cars rounded the corner, lights flashing, I knew he'd never forget it. The cul-de-sac was a frozen tableau, the morning sun now higher, bathing the scene in a harsh, unforgiving light. Doug knelt on the pavement, his hands raised, his once proud HOA uniform stained with sweat and shame. The pistol he'd brandished so recklessly lay discarded a few feet away, its dull gleam a pathetic reminder of his overreach. Claire stood over him, her FBI badge catching the sunlight, her posture calm but unyielding, like a judge about to deliver a verdict. The neighbors, their phones still raised, were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a reckoning, their whispers and gasps forming a low hum that pulsed through the air. Sirens wailed closer, their shrill cry slicing through the Virginia suburb like a warning of the storm to come. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling from the adrenaline of watching my daughter dismantle a man who thought a gun and a clipboard made him king. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Doug was just the first domino to fall, and the real chaos was about to begin. As the squad cars screeched into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing and doors flinging open, the scene snapped into motion. 3 black and white cruisers skidded to a halt, kicking up gravel and dust, their sirens cutting off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. Officers poured out, their hands on their holsters, their eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. They took one look at the situation, Claire standing tall with her badge, Doug cowering on the ground, a gun at his feet, and a dozen neighbors filming like amateur paparazzi, and moved fast. The lead officer, a woman with a no-nonsense face and a sergeant's stripes, approached Claire, her posture respectful but alert. "Agent Matthews?" she asked, her voice carrying the clipped professionalism of someone who'd seen her share of chaos. "That's me," Claire said, lowering her badge, but keeping her eyes on Doug. Her voice was calm, steady, as if she were briefing a team on a routine op, not standing in the middle of a suburban meltdown. Suspect brandished a firearm, threatened a federal officer, and attempted an unlawful detainment. Weapons on the ground, unsecured. He's compliant, but armed until proven otherwise. The sergeant nodded, her gaze flicking to Doug, who was still babbling about how he didn't know and was just doing his job. She didn't bother acknowledging him. Instead, she gestured to 2 officers who moved in with swift precision. One carefully secured Doug's pistol, sliding it into an evidence bag, while the other pulled Doug's arms behind his back, snapping cuffs on his wrists with a metallic click that echoed like a gavel. Doug whimpered, his voice a pathetic whine. "This is a mistake. I'm HOA security. I have rights." "Nobody cares, buddy," the cuffing officer muttered, hauling Doug to his feet. "You pointed a gun at an FBI agent. You're lucky you're still breathing." The crowd buzzed, phones capturing every second of Doug's humiliation. Some neighbors shook their heads, others whispered furiously, and a few, mostly the ones who'd endured Doug's petty tyranny for years, couldn't hide their smirks. Mrs. Harrow, clutching her yapping terrier, muttered something about "finally" under her breath. Mr. Peterson, still holding his wrench, gave a low whistle, like he was watching a particularly satisfying plot twist. The kids on their bikes were being herded back by their parents, but their eyes were wide, soaking in the drama like it was a live-action movie. Claire stepped back, giving the officers space to work, but her presence still dominated the scene. She was a quiet force, the kind of person who didn't need to shout to be heard. I walked closer, my legs still shaky, and stood beside her, not saying anything. There was nothing to say. She'd handled it, just like always. The look in her eyes said it all, She was in control, and Doug had picked the wrong fight. That's when Karen arrived, storming onto the scene like a hurricane in a pantsuit. Karen was the HOA president, a woman who wielded her authority like a scepter and her clipboard like a guillotine. In her late 50s, with a perm that looked like it hadn't changed since the Reagan administration, Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control. She'd built the HOA into her personal fiefdom, issuing fines for minor infractions, enforcing rules that seemed to exist only to stroke her ego, and cultivating a loyal cadre of followers who feared her wrath. To the neighbors, she was part dictator, part high school mean girl and all-nightmare. Her arrival now, with a clipboard thicker than a phone book and a scowl that could curdle milk, was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. "What the hell is going on here?" Karen demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She pointed a trembling finger at Claire, her eyes blazing with indignation. "This is private HOA jurisdiction. Non-residents have no right to be here, and I demand to know who you are." The crowd parted slightly, their phones swiveling to capture Karen's entrance. Claire didn't even glance at her focus still on the officers processing Doug. But when Karen took another step forward, shoving her clipboard toward Claire like it was a warrant, Claire finally turned her head, just enough to acknowledge the interruption. She raised her badge again, the gold catching the sunlight, and spoke in a tone so flat it could have frozen lava. "Agent Claire Matthews, FBI. I'm here because your so-called security officer committed a felony assault on a federal officer. If you interfere, you're looking at obstruction of justice, a felony punishable by up to 7 years in prison." Karen's face froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For a moment, it looked like she might back down, but Karen wasn't built for retreat. She shifted gears, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You're impersonating law enforcement. You have no jurisdiction here. The HOA has every right to detain and fine anyone we deem a threat." It was like watching a chicken scream at a freight train. The neighbors murmured, some stepping back, others leaning forward, their phones catching every word. Claire let Karen rant for exactly 30 seconds, her expression impassive, before cutting in with a single, chilling sentence. "Interfering with a federal investigation is a crime, Karen. Keep talking, and you'll be sharing a cell with your buddy Doug." Karen faltered, her clipboard dropping an inch, but she wasn't done. She blustered on, throwing out buzzwords like lawsuits, constitutional rights, and community standards, none of which had any bearing on the situation. Doug, now in the back of a cruiser, watched through the window, his face a mask of panic as his supposed ally unraveled. The sergeant, who'd been coordinating with her team, finally turned to Karen, her patience visibly fraying. "Ma'am," she said, her voice like a blade, "step back, or you're getting cuffed too." Karen's eyes widened, but she wasn't stupid enough to push it further. She clamped her mouth shut, her glare burning a hole into the pavement, and retreated a few steps, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. The crowd was alive now, their whispers turning into a low roar, their phones capturing the moment Karen's reign began to crack. This wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was a viral moment, the kind that would live on TikTok and Twitter for weeks. Claire, unbothered, turned back to the sergeant, giving a concise briefing on the incident dates, times, actions, witnesses, all delivered with the precision of a courtroom veteran. The officers listened, nodding, taking notes, while Doug sat in the cruiser, his head bowed, his dreams of HOA glory crumbling with every word. One officer radioed in, confirming Doug's lack of a concealed carry permit, which added another charge to his growing list: illegal possession of a firearm, impersonating an officer, unlawful detainment, and, of course, aggravated assault on a federal agent. He was cooked, and everyone knew it. But the fallout didn't stop with Doug. Karen, still hovering on the sidelines, tried one last desperate move, shoving her clipboard under the sergeant's nose and ranting about HOA bylaws. The sergeant, a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, stared at her like she was speaking in tongues. "Ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with exasperation, "your bylaws don't supersede federal law. Back off, or you're next." Karen's face turned blotchy, but she finally retreated, her loyalists trailing behind her like scolded dogs. The neighbors, though, were done with her. The phones kept rolling, the whispers grew louder, and the air was thick with a new kind of energy, anger. Yes, but also something else. Relief. For years, Karen and her HOA had ruled through fear, fining people for trivial infractions, turning neighbors against each other, creating a culture of suspicion and resentment. Now, in the span of an hour, Claire had exposed it all as a sham, a house of cards built on ego and intimidation. As the cruisers pulled away, Doug's pale face visible through the window, Claire allowed herself the tiniest smile, not of victory, but of satisfaction. She'd stopped a bully before he could hurt anyone, and she'd done it without firing a shot. She turned to me, her voice light, almost playful. "Any coffee left, Dad?" I nodded, still half in shock, and led her back to the house, the neighbors' eyes following us like we were celebrities. Inside, the kitchen was still warm, the smell of donuts lingering, but the world outside had changed. Claire sat at the table, sipping her coffee, as if nothing had happened, while I tried to process the fact that my daughter had just turned our quiet cul-de-sac into ground zero for an HOA apocalypse. Outside, the Real show was just beginning. Word spread faster than wildfire, neighbors who'd missed the live performance showing up on foot, in cars, even on golf carts, pestering anyone who'd seen it for details. Smartphones flashed like paparazzi cameras, and the stories grew wilder with every retelling. Some said Doug had pulled an assault rifle, others swore Claire had disarmed him with a single move, like something out of a kung fu movie. Karen, conspicuously absent, was either plotting her comeback or hiding in shame, both equally dangerous in her case. Claire, ever the professional, wasn't content to let it end with Doug. Over coffee, she mentioned the possibility of other HOA security members being armed, a thought that hadn't even crossed my mind. If Doug had a gun and a god complex, she said, her voice thoughtful, who's to say the rest of his squad doesn't? She pulled out her phone, tapping out messages to colleagues who specialized in rapid intel sweeps, her fingers moving with the speed of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Within minutes, she'd set the wheels in motion, not for a formal investigation yet, but for a quiet check on the HOA's so-called security team. Her instincts were dead on. An hour later, one of the responding officers called her directly, reporting that they'd found another HOA security member wandering the neighborhood with an illegally modified baton and a taser disguised as a flashlight. No permits, no certifications, just blind entitlement and bad judgment. The officer added that the HOA's security operation might be entirely unauthorized, a civil violation at minimum, with potential criminal charges depending on what they uncovered. Claire thanked him, hung up, and smiled over her coffee, like she'd just been handed a puzzle she couldn't wait to solve. By mid-afternoon, the police had canvassed the area, turning up more HOA security members carrying everything from pepper spray to illegal stun guns. One genius even had brass knuckles displayed on his belt, like he thought they were part of a legitimate uniform. The officers collected the contraband, took statements from over a dozen witnesses, and made it clear the investigation was just getting started. Claire watched from the kitchen window, her second cup of coffee in hand, looking as unbothered as if she were watching a predictable rom-com instead of a slow-motion train wreck. The neighbors, meanwhile, were growing bolder. They clustered in our driveway, murmuring, casting glances at the house, some hoping Claire would emerge for an encore, others just wanting to thank her. A few, like Mr. Peterson, brought over casseroles and homemade cookies, their way of saying sorry for letting the HOA's reign of terror go unchecked. Claire accepted the gestures with her usual humility, cracking jokes to put them at ease, but her mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the bigger picture. Then Karen made her reappearance, striding down the street like a queen whose castle was under siege. Flanked by 2 loyalists, she ignored the neighbors trying to stop her, brushing off questions and glares with the arrogance of someone who still thought she was untouchable. When she reached our porch, Claire was ready, opening the door before Karen could knock, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp, like a hawk spotting prey. Karen launched into a tirade, accusing Claire of harassment, threatening lawsuits against her and the FBI, demanding Doug's immediate release, as if she could rewrite reality by sheer force of will. Claire listened for exactly 45 seconds, her expression blank, before cutting her off with a single question, delivered with surgical precision. Did you know your security officer pulled a loaded firearm on a federal agent, Karen? Because that's a federal crime, and if you approved his actions, you're on the hook too. Karen blinked, thrown off by Claire's cold, unyielding logic. She tried to recover, insisting she had no idea Doug was armed, that the security team was just a visual deterrent, that she'd never authorized weapons. Her voice cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched her clipboard, but Claire wasn't buying it. With the same calm she'd used on Doug, she asked if Karen would provide the HOA's financial records to prove no funds had been used for unauthorized security gear. Karen paled, mumbling about needing to consult the board, then fled the porch like a scolded child, her loyalists trailing behind. Claire stepped back inside, closing the door with a quiet click, and grinned at me. "This is about to get really interesting," she said, her voice tinged with the excitement of someone who lived for unraveling corruption. She explained that small-time power brokers like Karen always got sloppy, cutting corners, ignoring accountability, assuming they'd never get caught. When they did, they panicked, and in their panic, they revealed more than they intended. Claire bet there was a paper trail in the HOA's records leading straight to Karen's door, and she was itching to find it. The real tipping point came when the local news caught wind of the story. By sunset, a helicopter buzzed overhead, its cameras zooming in on the cul-de-sac where HOA law enforcement had been exposed as a farce. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors, capturing sound bites about the absurdity of it all. The HOA board issued a vague statement about reviewing internal policies and reaffirming commitment to community safety, but nobody bought it. The damage was done, and the neighbors were done playing along. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different, like a storm had swept through and stripped away the veneer of HOA harmony. Whispers replaced forced smiles, awkward glances replaced polite nods, and a new tension hung in the air, not fear, but anticipation. Claire sat outside with her coffee, sunglasses on, scrolling her phone like nothing had happened, but we both knew the volcano was rumbling. The HOA emergency meeting was set for noon at the community center, billed as a friendly open forum but destined to be a battlefield. As Claire and I walked to the meeting, the parking lot was a zoo, cars spilling onto curbs, lawns, even half illegally into alleys. The entire neighborhood had shown up, some outraged, some scared, most just there for the drama. Inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Karen stood at the front, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She tapped the microphone nervously, her smile stretched tight, like a substitute teacher facing a room full of delinquents. Claire and I took seats near the back, giving her a clear view of the room. She leaned over, whispering, "Always sit in the back at these things. Less chance of getting boxed in if it goes south." I nodded, stifling a laugh, because it sounded like advice for a war zone, not a suburban clubhouse. Karen's speech was a masterclass in empty platitudes, vague promises to address concerns, and improve safety procedures, all delivered with the sincerity of a used car salesman. She avoided mentioning Doug, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a volunteer, as if that erased the gun he'd pulled. Claire raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, playing the long game. The crowd was restless, their murmurs growing louder, but Karen almost pulled it off, her bureaucratic nonsense lulling them into complacency. Then the questions started. An elderly man asked why the security team had firearms at all. Karen dodged, claiming they were never authorized. A quiet woman stood, asking if HOA funds had bought the confiscated gear. Karen blanched, promising transparency after an internal review. The room shifted, the crowd leaning forward, sensing blood. Then Claire stood. The air sucked out of the room as she introduced herself as an FBI tactical commander, her voice calm but commanding. Phones lifted, heads turned, the board members flinched. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. Claire didn't accuse or rant. She laid out facts with surgical precision. Weapons confiscated, HOA funds misused, a federal inquiry underway. The room exploded, shouts, accusations, demands. Claire stayed cool, letting the chaos swirl, while Karen flailed, screaming that Claire was lying, that she had no jurisdiction. Claire didn't respond. She handed a folded sheet of paper to an officer in the room, a formal notice of federal investigation, signed and sealed. The officer read it aloud, and that was it. Karen's supporters melted away. The board members edged back, one even resigning mid-meeting. Within minutes, Karen stood alone, her voice breaking as she tried to salvage her dignity. The crowd wanted blood, and they got it. They voted to suspend Karen and most of the board, forming an interim committee of sensible volunteers who'd stayed out of the power games. Claire sat down, sipping her coffee, watching Karen's empire crumble. She'd done what no one else dared, exposed the HOA's corruption, empowered the neighbors, and walked away without a scratch. Outside, as the sun dipped low, neighbors thanked her, offering pies and apologies, but Claire just smiled, humble as ever. She'd saved the neighborhood from itself, and as we walked home, I knew this was just another day for her, a small battle won, a bully stopped, a community reminded that justice wasn't just for headlines. It was for cul-de-sacs, too. The cul-de-sac was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt like it had been scrubbed clean, the air lighter, the tension that had hung over every lawn and mailbox for years finally gone. The sun rose soft and golden, painting the streets in a warm glow, and for the first time in a long time, the kids were out early, their bikes weaving lazy loops, their laughter bouncing off the houses. Neighbors waved to each other, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to, their smiles free of the forced politeness that had once masked fear of Karen's clipboard or Doug's golf cart. It was as if an invisible storm had rolled through, stripping away the petty tyrannies and leaving something real in its wake. My daughter, Claire, sat on the porch with her coffee, sunglasses perched on her nose, scrolling her phone like she hadn't just turned our suburban bubble upside down. But that was Claire, calm in the chaos, unshaken by the spotlight, always ready to move on to the next mission. I joined her outside, my own coffee in hand, settling into the wicker chair beside her. The neighborhood was waking up, but it felt different, like a town that had just survived a siege. The HOA's reign of terror was over, and the people were starting to realize they didn't need Karen's rules or Doug's fake badge to feel safe. Claire had done that. She'd walked into a mess of arrogance and entitlement, faced down a loaded gun, and dismantled a corrupt system without raising her voice. And now, as the dust settled, the neighbors were grappling with what it meant to live in a place that suddenly felt like a community again. "Sleep okay?" I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Claire glanced at me, a half-smile tugging at her lips. "Like a baby." "You?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Barely." Kept replaying yesterday in my head. You staring down that gun like it was a water pistol. Karen melting down like a reality TV villain. "It's a lot." She shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. "Just another day at the office." That was a lie, and we both knew it. Claire's office was usually a high-stakes world of hostage crises, bomb threats, and active shooters, not suburban parking disputes. But that's what made her so extraordinary. To her, the small battles mattered just as much as the big ones. A bully with a gun in a cul-de-sac was no less dangerous than a terrorist in a city because both thrived on fear, and Claire had made it her mission to stop fear in its tracks, no matter where it showed up. The neighbors were starting to stir, their gratitude spilling out in small, earnest ways. Mr. Peterson, the guy with the vintage Mustang, dropped off a tray of brownies, muttering something about how he should have stood up to Doug years ago. Mrs. Harrow, still clutching her terrier, brought a plate of lemon bars and a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for saving us." Even the kids got in on it, a group of them shyly leaving a construction paper card on our porch, covered in glitter and misspelled words like hero and FBI lady. Claire accepted it all with her usual humility, cracking jokes to put people at ease, but I could see the weight of their thanks in her eyes. She didn't do this for the applause, but she knew what it meant to them. The fallout from the HOA's collapse was still unfolding, and it was glorious. Karen's house went up for sale faster than a Black Friday deal, listed through some out-of-town agency nobody recognized. Whispers circulated about frozen bank accounts, pending lawsuits, and an IRS audit that had her sweating bullets. Her once loyal followers had scattered, and the few who still clung to her were too embarrassed to show their faces. On the day the moving trucks rolled in, a group of teenagers staged an impromptu farewell parade, marching past her driveway with handmade signs that read "Bye, Karen," and "Good luck finding a new kingdom." Karen, true to form, tried to call the cops, but the officers who showed up just shrugged and drove off, leaving her to scowl from her half-empty porch. Nobody came to her defense. Nobody shed a tear when her SUV peeled out of the neighborhood for the last time. Doug's story was even bleaker. Word from the courthouse was that his trial was set for the following month, with a laundry list of charges that could land him in prison for years: aggravated assault on a federal officer, illegal possession of a firearm, impersonating an officer, unlawful detainment. His lawyer tried spinning a sob story about Doug being traumatized by imagined threats to the neighborhood, but it fell flat. Nobody bought it, least of all the neighbors who'd spent years dodging his petty citations. Claire, when she heard, gave a short, sharp laugh, not cruel, but the kind of laugh you let out when someone's predictable excuse lands exactly where you expected. "They always play the victim when the cuffs go on," she said, shaking her head. "Never fails." The new HOA leadership was a breath of fresh air, a group of volunteers who'd stayed out of the old power games. They rewrote the rules with transparency in mind, posting financial disclosures online every month, holding open forums where people could actually speak without fear of being fined. The so-called security team was gone for good, replaced by a rotating neighborhood watch that focused on block parties and cleanup days, not patrolling like prison wardens. The heavy, toxic atmosphere that had choked the community for so long lifted, replaced by something lighter, freer. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real, and that was enough. Claire's name started popping up at barbecues and mailboxes, not as gossip, but as a kind of quiet legend. People talked about that day with a mix of awe and gratitude, recounting how she'd stood between them and a bully's gun, how she'd faced down Karen's empire and walked away unscathed. They didn't know the half of it: her years of training, her missions in places she couldn't talk about, her ability to stay calm when the world was falling apart. To them, she was the woman who'd saved their neighborhood, and that was enough. The media frenzy didn't help. The story of the HOA gone wild had gone viral, picked up by local news, then national outlets, even landing a segment on a morning show with a cheesy headline, "When Neighborhood Rules Turn Rogue." Claire, thankfully, stayed out of the spotlight, her name never mentioned in the coverage. But around here, everyone knew. Every morning when she stepped outside for her coffee, someone would wave a little too eagerly, or a neighbor would nervously offer a plate of cookies, their way of saying thanks without making a fuss. It was a strange kind of fame, the kind you earned by standing unshakable when everyone else was losing their heads. Claire didn't stick around to bask in it. Her departure day came faster than I wanted, her Jeep packed with the same casual efficiency she brought to everything. The neighborhood organized a send-off, nothing fancy, just lawn chairs in the cul-de-sac, folding tables covered in homemade snacks, and a giant poster board scrawled with "Thank you" and dozens of signatures. Claire stood in the middle of it, shaking hands, cracking jokes about starting an HOA SWAT team that sent everyone into fits of laughter. She accepted the thanks with grace, never once acting like the hero she was, even though every person there knew she'd saved them from a nightmare. Before she left, she pulled me aside for a quiet moment, away from the crowd. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and for a second, it felt like she was still the kid who'd begged me to check for monsters under her bed. "I'm not worried about this place anymore," she said, her voice soft but certain. These people were scared into silence for so long, they forgot they had power. Real power, not the fake kind Karen and Doug were peddling. They've got it back now, and I think they'll hold on to it. I nodded, my throat tight. "They will," I said. "Because of you." She smiled, a real smile, not the one she used to disarm suspects or diffuse crowds. "Just doing my job, Dad." But it was more than that, and we both knew it. Claire wasn't just doing her job. She was living her purpose, fighting for the kind of justice that didn't always make headlines, but changed lives all the same. As she climbed into her Jeep, the neighbors waving and clapping, I felt a pride so fierce it nearly knocked me over. My daughter had faced down a gun, a corrupt HOA, and a system built on fear, and she'd done it with nothing but her wits, her badge, and a coffee in hand. Watching her drive away, the taillights of her Jeep fading down the newly peaceful street, I knew this wasn't just a victory for our cul-de-sac. It was a reminder that justice wasn't some abstract ideal reserved for courtrooms or war zones. It was here, in the everyday places, coffee shops, front yards, ordinary streets where real people lived. Claire had shown us that, not by preaching or posturing, but by standing up and saying enough. She'd reminded us that real authority wasn't about shouting the loudest or carrying the biggest stick. It was about protecting the people who couldn't always protect themselves, even when they didn't know they needed it. The days that followed felt like a slow, satisfying exhale. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one where kids played without looking over their shoulders, where parents chatted without worrying about being reported, where elderly couples walked hand in hand without being hassled. The HOA's old rules, fines for hedge heights, citations for mailbox colors, were laughed off, replaced by a shared understanding that being neighborly was more important than being right. Laughter filled the parks again, barbecues spilled into the streets, and the cul-de-sac became a place where people lived, not just existed. Claire's story lingered, a quiet undercurrent in every conversation. At a block party a few weeks later, someone raised a glass to the FBI lady, and the crowd cheered, their voices carrying into the night. They didn't know she was out there somewhere, chasing bigger threats, facing real bad guys in places we'd never see. They didn't need to. What mattered was what she'd left behind, a community that had found its courage, a neighborhood that had learned to stand together, a cul-de-sac that felt like home again. And that, I realized, was the real power of what Claire did. It wasn't just about stopping Doug or toppling Karen. It was about showing us that justice isn't a headline or a medal. It's a choice, a stand, a refusal to let bullies win, no matter how small their kingdom. Every kid riding their bike, every neighbor sharing a beer, every quiet evening on the porch was a testament to that choice. Claire hadn't just saved our neighborhood. She'd reminded us that the world could be better, not through grand gestures, but through the stubborn, unshakable belief that right could triumph over wrong, even in a cul-de-sac. Somewhere out there, I knew Claire was doing it again. Different town, different faces, same mission. She wasn't chasing fame or glory. She was chasing something bigger, a world where the petty tyrants, the fake kings with their fake crowns, would always have to answer to someone who stood for something real. Someone who didn't just talk about justice, but lived it every single day. Someone who, no matter the odds, would never back down. And as I sat on the porch, the stars blinking to life above, I felt a gratitude so deep it anchored me to the earth. That someone, that unstoppable force, was my daughter. And because of her, the cul-de-sacs of the world would always have a chance to shine.